I've delivered a lot of presentations in my day, but I've never begun with such an amazing preamble. And those are big shoes to fill. The level of truth and beauty that we just experienced is something which it's a tough act to follow. I want to thank Kirsten. I want to thank everybody here for coming, for all of the organizers behind the scenes who made this possible. Coming to Switzerland, to Europe, has been something that Cynthia and I have been longing to do for a long time, and we were just talking about the need to basically get out more. We do a lot of interviews, a lot of presentations over Zoom, we do a lot of writing, but the actual offer that Kirsten made for us to jump over the pond from Canada and come and speak to an event hosted by Kernpunkte was an opportunity we couldn't afford to miss, and especially with such a theme of the nature of humankind. I mean, who could say no to that? And we are in a moment right now where a lot of people are afraid. They're afraid for good reasons. We're living through a historical moment that many people do not get to live through, to experience. And so in some ways, this is new terrain, although there are historical precedents. We have periods of renaissances, we have periods of dark ages. We've got periods where ideas that were in harmony with natural law were able to thrive, to blossom, and other times when they were thwarted, when folly, corruption took, unfortunately, the ruling, the ship of state to a bad direction. So we're going through turbulent times. We're going through the end of a system. And even though, for those who have seen their program, they noticed that the class that or the presentation I was preparing to deliver was titled Transforming Useless Eaters into Useful Creators. I was thinking on the plane ride over that perhaps, since this is going to be an early presentation, it would be better to maybe change the focus a little bit and introduce some elements of geopolitics. I'm very happy that Kirsten introduced some elements of very important philosophy, and I'm very happy that these important concepts of beauty have been expressed. And thinking just quickly about something Kirsten was making a point about regarding the difference that has been forgotten of the qualitative difference between human beings and other forms of life, as beautiful as all life is. There is qualitative differences that have been obscured, which have made our current society susceptible to certain false lines of reasoning, certain false modes of feeling, which has driven us into a place where it's very difficult for many people to think through the lies that are behind the surface appearance of arguments that appear to be attractive on the surface, that some politicians say. And we've all seen, I think, our fair share of ugliness, of ugly lies that brought us all here. I mean, I don't think that many people would have come here had they not realized that there are many very dangerous lies pushing us in a direction. One of the points is that Kirsten made that I really liked is that animals see, human beings can do more. Animals see they can express sight with their eyes, they see things, but human beings alone can see sight. We could see it, but not through our eyes. The power of sight that causes the eye, that causes the reason why things see, is something which can be seen, but only through the mind's eye, when we learn to think with reason, right? When we learn to see behind the surface of things to causality. And I remember Gottfried Leibniz, a wonderful, wonderful philosopher and metaphysician and statesman, made a point that I first didn't understand this, when he said, it would be incorrect to follow the materialists who say that we see because we have eyes. That would be incorrect. Instead, he said it would be more appropriate to say that we have eyes in order to express sight. It seems like a small difference, but it's a very big difference that gets at the core topic of the question that I'm going to address in the course of the following hour or so, called Open versus Closed Systems, the Growth Needs of Humanity in the 21st Century and Beyond. In the course of this exercise, we're going to look at some ideas of principle on the very large, general concepts that one might call universal, the question of the power of sight being something that is, I would think, in the Platonic domain of the eternal, the immutable. Eyes come and go. But sight is something which is beyond that. It is transcendental. And we're going to look at different manifestations in history and in the future and in the present that are shaping our present moment of potential. And that is what we're in. This tension that we're feeling is ripe with potential for great good or great bad. that is underdetermined, and a lot of that is being affected by the free will, the choices that we make coming out of today, how we choose to see ourselves, and the self-identity that we choose to give ourselves going forward. And it is about free will at the end of the day. The question of listening to Felix Mendelssohn, who said, he was somebody who kept Beethoven's method alive, and Beethoven had a very important point regarding his musical composition, which he said, my aspiration is to be as rigorous as it is free. My music must be as rigorous as it is free. That seems like a paradox, because people think rigor, lawfulness, structure, freedom, these are two incompatible ways. You have to pick one or the other, be a right-brained or be a left-brained person, right? Be a feeler or be a thinker. That is a fallacy. And the fact that we just were moved through something that involved lawful harmonics, lawful rhythm, but also an unspeakable beauty that we couldn't put words to, is, I think, a great demonstration of the coexistence of freedom and reason and creativity when it's done in a real organic way. So one last thought before I plunge into the following slides, is that following on the question of we see in order to express sight, or we have eyes in order to express sight, one could say as well, if you were let's say if you were a Davos creature, a technocrat materialist who doesn't believe that such things like freedom or dignity or beauty have any merit, because these are abstractions created by people but are not scientific. What is scientific is the atoms, the material world that we live in, the forces of the cold laws of nature. Well, they would say, well, beauty, justice, freedom, these things exist because there are people. If there were no people, there would be no such things. One could inversely use the Leibniz method and say, well, maybe people exist in order to express freedom, justice, beauty, creativity that are already there in nature, that are the immutable, eternal principles filling all of the universe, both within and beyond, right? And it takes you into two very different worlds of thinking about everything else. You could use the same words. Two people who live in these two different paradigms, the materialist from Davos. We're going to meet one or two of them. Cynthia is also going to introduce you to a few creatures tomorrow as well. They use similar words as somebody who thinks like a human being, but you could see that the ideas associated with the words are very different. So I wanted to plunge into this question of the two systems that are currently pulling us into two different directions as a society, by beginning with a beautiful quote that I loved from a universal history lecture by Friedrich Schiller, from his 1791 comparative analysis of the constitutions of Lycurgus's Sparta and Solon's Athens. And Schiller really set the tone very nicely for this presentation, because he basically said, how do you evaluate laws? How do you evaluate good versus bad laws? Some people might say, oh, but it's a law, you have to follow it. But if the law is designed to enslave you, well, is that really a law in that? It might be an unlawful law. It might be a form of violence, as St. Aquinas proved and demonstrated, as did St. Augustine. So Schiller says, in general, we can establish a rule for judging political institutions, that they are only good and laudable to the extent that they bring all of the forces inherent in persons to flourish, to the extent that they promote the progress of culture, or at least not hinder it. This rule applies to religious laws as well as to political ones. Both are contemptible if they constrain a power of the human mind, if they impose upon the mind any sort of stagnation. A law, for example, by which at a particular time appeared to be to it most fitting, such a law were an assault against mankind, and laudable intents of whatever kind were then incapable of justifying it. It were immediately directed against the highest good, against the highest purpose of society. I'm sorry for the translators who didn't have this quote, I just threw it in there. So, what are the two systems? What are the two ideas of law? Well, some people might know of this figure named Antonio Guterres. And in last year, September 27th, he made a point that I think is a useful point that plays into what I want to say today. When he said, I fear our world is creeping towards two different sets of economic, trade, financial, and technological rules. Two divergent approaches in the development of artificial intelligence, and ultimately two different military and geopolitical strategies. This is a recipe for trouble. It would be far less predictable and far more dangerous than the Cold War. That's true. He observed something very true. A lot of people miss that. And if you were asking, well, which one of those two different strategies, paradigms of economics, trade, technology, does he situate himself as? Well, the reason why he's shaking the hand of Mr. Schwab is because a year before this, he made a little bit of a devil's pact integrating the World Economic Forum into the United Nations. That doesn't necessarily mean everything in the United Nations is bad, but it is a big coup d'etat. And it does situate his heart and mind. Where is he invested? And what does he represent? So what is he talking about? Now, a lot of people talk about, I talk about open versus closed systems a lot. Multipolar, unipolar systems that are sort of pulling with two different intentions, two different paradigms onto our future. In my assessment, I think one of those paradigms, with its faults, is much more in harmony with natural law and the general well-being of mankind's true nature than the other one. I'm going to go into some reasons why. We're going to look at a lot of case studies, some examples of both of these open versus closed systems, but I just wanted to do a quick rundown, just to make it simple. So in the simplest way, open systems are defined, as I point out here, non-zero sum. All right, the idea that the whole is equivalent to the sum of parts, or is the whole more than the sum of parts? Again, seems like a little bit of a dispute. It's a big difference, right? If you think that I'm just the sum total of the atoms that make me up, well, then where's the space left for the soul, for the question of the identity that is Matthew, right? When I look to myself in the mirror today, and I compare myself to the child who was 4 years old looking in the mirror many years ago, it's mostly all different atoms, right? All of the molecules that made me up then, the vast majority have been born, have died, have been replaced, but something remains. The feeling that I had when I heard a lie, the feeling, there's certain qualities about my identity which must be more than the sum total of the parts. So non-zero sum versus zero sum, right? The whole is, as I said, more than the sum of its parts. That in open systems, there are relative limits to growth. So whether you're dealing with a society that was 100 years ago in Basel or 200 years ago in Montreal, there would have been certain limits pressing on that society's potential. The average life expectancy in Montreal would have been 43 years of age in 1900. Today, maybe about 80. The ability to sustain people was contingent upon a lack of utilization of electricity, the lack of certain discoveries in medical technologies, which would have involved people dying that didn't need to, or babies dying that didn't need to, which today we know we have been able to overcome. But it's all contingent upon the discoveries that were made or not made, right? The mind's metaphysical ability to penetrate into the secret laws of nature by eurekas, that then can be translated into new types of technologies, allow us to overcome those limits to growth if we're moral. If we're moral enough to, one, make the discoveries, number two, moral enough to allow for the transformation in an improved way to the society as a whole that will benefit from those discoveries. So those two things have to be made. And on top of that, the willingness to prepare the groundwork for future such discoveries that always need to be made, because there will always be limits pressing on us. The question is, what's more important, the ability to leap over the limits, or is it the limits, the constraints that define whether we can have 1 billion, 8 billion, 20 billion, or more or fewer? Some people today think that we should have fewer. Some people think it's maybe 1 billion is all that should be permitted in a world dominated by inbred oligarchs. That might be attractive to some people. I think it's horrendous. Feudalism, I don't think that was ever, people make a case that maybe feudalism had a purpose in its time. I don't even think it did. Win-win cooperation. So for a political application, every time we see this open system approach express itself, there's a focus on win-win. Where do all participants benefit from certain actions, instead of this idea of win-lose, which we'll see more of. And for political effects today, multipolar. There's an idea of the sovereignty of nations in the idea of how different units of society generate international treaties, laws, accords. Do you have one center of command that imposes itself onto the system? Or do you allow for multiple centers of gravity where a constant dialogue, a constant symphony of sorts is a more compatible analogy in that type of world? So that's a quick overview. There's probably more that could be said, but I'll keep it there. Closed systems is kind of the opposite of everything I just said. So, zero sum, the whole is the sum of its parts. That's it. There's only so much pie to go around, so that in a world of a closed system thinker, you live in a world of limits, of scarcity, of diminishing returns, so that the more babies you have, that's the more mouths that require food, that's the more pollution machines, that's less space for everyone else, the more people, right? That's a very nightmarish way of looking at babies who are potentially all brilliant geniuses. Think about every one of the 45,000 children working in Congolese cobalt mines for our cell phones and photovoltaic cells for Green New Deals. Those 40,000 children could equally all be a Felix Mendelssohn, a Beethoven, or an Einstein. But certain opportunities have been deprived. So that's one of the effects of zero-sum thinking. You live in a world that is of scarcity. You don't create abundance, you create scarcity. The whole is thus the sum of its parts. The limits to growth are presumed to be absolute. We must only adapt to limits. We cannot overcome them, because if we overcame them, well, I'm sorry, certain vested interests who have monopolized the trees, the lumber, might not like that creative people discovered that by burning this dark stuff, we can get more efficiency of heat to do more work that supports more people at a higher quality of life, but that renders all of the monopolized lumber that was formerly being burnt to keep warm and cook our food, that renders that a lot less strategically viable to manipulate wars, to reap profits. Same thing as we go into oil, same thing as we go into the atom. Each time a new discovery is made, it renders the old system, the old structures, fragile. Right? And those who had vested interests in those old structures, including structures of thought in the textbooks, are also, they lose their strategic advantage. So there's a political application to this. Obviously, based on everything I've just said, it's win-lose. It's competition-focused. It's based on a race of each against all in a world of diminishing returns. It's extremely Darwinian in that sense. Right? The rule of the strongest will and the fittest will survive. The weakest will be weeded out. And as I mentioned, it's unipolar, one center of command. It doesn't allow for the confidence in free will, in the ability for people to think for themselves, to overcome their problems. It's very insecure in that sense. So you're in a closed system when, well, there's a few shadows. So just like one could say from a Platonic perspective that we see things, the things we see are the shadows. The cause, the light itself, is the light of reason that sees sight, that sees the idea of justice, that sees the idea of freedom. But there's an ability to see with something beyond the senses. So the shadows of a closed system reaching its lawful climax of crisis looks something like this. This is a North American grid featuring a breakdown of about 170 years. The point that I think is the most useful here is around 1970, when we all of a sudden had a steep decline in the industrial manufacturing product, the output of society, the jobs that were associated with production, started steeply declining while simply services began to massively increase. Agriculture went down. That period of the early 70s is an important period where a new paradigm of money, of value, became dominant. But it became dominant not because it was the natural course of human destiny. It became dominant because there were political agencies that killed people like Martin Luther King Jr., that killed people like Bobby Kennedy, 1968, earlier John F. Kennedy, Enrico Mattei, Dag Hammarskjöld. There's many more. But this type of transformation of society could only happen through the destruction of certain key figures who would not be willing to let that happen over their dead bodies. Another example of when you're in a crisis point is, what are the potentials? Right? People talk about reality. Well, what is more real, potential or reality as it is in the present? Well, I would say in thinking about this, potential is more important in many ways than reality. Reality comes and goes. It's always fleeting. Potential is something which is always there, but always affected by our decisions, our thoughts, our ideas, our will. One of the things was the lack of will. John F. Kennedy had made a focus to have nuclear fusion power as the new domain that would transcend hydrocarbons within a few decades. The idea of going beyond the limits on Earth towards space exploration, which he called for. He drove this. He fought against the military-industrial complex. He even invited the Russians to work with the Americans in 1963, 1 month before he died, when he gave a United Nations speech saying, well, let's work together to end the Cold War, to end mutual assured destruction, and create a climate of cooperation where both sides put forth a vision and a program to land a Russian and an American together on the moon, and as John F. Kennedy said, to go beyond that, to always seek new limits and new discoveries. That faith in the future completely collapsed as the ideas of fusion power, fusion rockets, the Minerva rocket, which John F. Kennedy also invested massively in, was all canceled over his death. And the new groupings that came in, people like Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, David Rockefeller, the Trilateral Commission, which many of you know of, ended up doing something that involved shutting down all investments into R&D, into fusion. And as we see, these are charts that were made back in 1978 with the actual funding, meaning what was called fusion never. And people say fusion's always 30 years away. Well, it's because they actually didn't give the money necessary for scientists to build the prototypes to test their ideas. And they let these great scientists get old, demoralized, and die off, never getting to actually test their thoughts. And these are different scenarios that were put forth in the 70s by a congressional committee on what would be done if proper resources and vision that was long-term were provided. Another example, the collapse of, that's in the universe of the small, the geometry of the atom. But what about the geometry of the macrocosm? The peak funding for NASA was 1965. It immediately was slashed every year after 1965 when it was peaked at 4.5% of GDP, down to less than 0.5%. So this was, again, a demoralization after NASA was killed, the opportunity to find new ways of changing the rules of the great game on Earth. The mutual assured destruction was annihilated as people were kept in a controlled environment, a closed system. And we could see the effects. The ethos that made our society viable was premised around the concept that the simple maintenance and also improvement of vital infrastructure, water systems. This is, for example, a Chicago metropolitan train track support beam rotted out. This picture was taken this year. 34,000 passengers on 70 trains cross this pylon every day, right? That's insane. That would take a few $100s worth of soldering iron and maybe some steel to fix that. This is one tiny symptom of a macro problem, right? The US Society of Civil Engineers has assessed that approximately $5 trillion needs to be invested simply to bring basic infrastructure up to safety standards. It's that bad. And I mean, we can go on, but just to give you a taste. So the physical economic basis has been hollowed out under a world of exporting our factories to cheaper and cheaper labor markets as we transformed what was once, a society of sovereign people who could produce and consume into a society of consumers. And that was the idea. We're now in a consumer society. We can now just consume, and that's all we need. We'll let people we don't have to look at do the dirty work in Africa and Asia, and we'll just be the beautiful people that just consume. And somehow things will work out. That's insane. But certain people who knew better didn't take a stand. And so we now have the consequences of those foolish decisions. That can be corrected, but a different way of thinking about politics and economy has to be rediscovered. I won't say be created, but be rediscovered since we once had it. It's there. On a financial level, I think the last graph I'd like to show is what was growth? Because we were told for the past 40 years, there's growth, there's economic growth. That's what everyone was told every year in macroeconomics and business school. Where's the growth? Well, what they've been looking at has not been the real economy, the thing that supports human life. That's not what they were looking at. That's what the old value system of economists who are obsolete used to think about. The new economists were trained to worship money, and were trained to look at the variables that involved speculating on debts, right? Creating debts that maybe could never be paid, bundling them, gambling with them, insuring on them, gambling on the insurance on those, and that was what became, in different ways, derivatives. So just this is a 2012 graph featuring just simply the big 5 American too-big-to-fail banks that we've been pouring money into. Canada has its own too-big-to-fail, Germany, Switzerland, we all know what the case is. These banks have created mergers and acquisitions overseen by things like the Jacob Rothschild Inter-Alpha Group that set up the stage in the 1970s for the deregulation of the system that would then permit the things that would formerly be seen as illegal, right? The idea of speculating on unpayable debts was something you would go to jail for in the 1960s. Then it became something you learned in Harvard University by the 1990s. So this is a bubble upon bubble upon bubble that we've been printing money out of thin air to simply keep these zombie banks afloat for over 10 years. That's insane as well. The real economy has not benefited by the money printing. So what are some of the geopolitical effects? Oh, and keep in mind, I just want to say, if anybody at any time wanted to deal with this the proper way, instating Glass-Steagall would have been a very easy, and still is a very easy, viable thing to do, to break up the banks, separate the cancerous tissue from the healthy tissue, and start a process of rehabilitation of the real economy. That can be done, but it requires that people think about the symptoms more seriously. They have to think kind of like like a doctor, like Franklin Roosevelt, who did this in the 1930s. So look to the past expression of when this sort of thing was done. When did we break up banks? When did we subvert great resets, one world governments? When? Because it's been done. All right, so what are some of the geopolitical manifestations? Well, every day we're told by the mainstream media, we open up the newspaper, we look at the TV, or our news feed on social media, and we see different hotspots. You know, Ukraine has been on fire for a year. That's a crisis. Moldova, increasingly there's discussion around Transnistria, finding itself under attack maybe. We have National Endowment for Democracy, CIA operatives working to light fires, even in Kosovo, trying to instill or stimulate a breakaway orientation in Kosovo. And we have the same thing in Georgia right now. There's riots in Georgia over a simple bill that would involve foreign-funded organizations to simply state that they're foreign-funded. That's all it is. The West does it, but that's not permitted in the eyes of Samantha Powers or the other creeps at the US State Department who wish to use color revolutions to destabilize governments that they don't like, that are acting too nationalist. So Georgia, a candidate for NATO that's already been overthrown by a color revolution before, is being set on fire. Hungary, has seen Samantha Powers recently pour tens of millions of dollars into the reactivation of every single destabilizing organization that the U.S. has at its disposal. Syria, once more, is being lit on fire with white helmets, other Western Front groups to, again, try to bring back the policy of regime change there. Iran, the Undersecretary of State for the United States recently said Iran has 7 days before they have a nuclear bomb. That's absurd. But these are messagings that are very seriously being put out for a gullible Western population. Japan is talking about acquiring US-made long-range missiles and medium-range missiles, which are a direct threat on China. They're also talking about joining a new Pacific NATO, along with a variety of other Pacific nations. South Africa is witnessing the dangerous, what seems to be another color revolutionary effort to destabilize them. And all of this is being told to us by the media as if it's all separate things. As I think everyone can guess, they're all part of the same thing. What I just mentioned regarding the breakdown of the system is one element. The other thing, the other unifying factor, which helps a lot, is to just sort of hold in the mind's eye the whole. The 880 plus US military bases spread out around the world. That helps a lot, because I guarantee you the countries like China, like Russia, like India, like Iran, like Syria, every other country that is not willing to sacrifice their people and their traditions over some altar of a great reset, they're looking at this very seriously. And what you have right now is 100,000 US troops stationed in the Pacific, 50,000 in Japan, 28,000 in South Korea, missile shield in South Korea, which are just US military colonies. And these things can be used to deploy against China, against Russia. You have the same thing with what's called full spectrum dominance, with an anti-ballistic missile shield that can become offensive very quickly around Russia's perimeter from the south. And you even have an increasing discussion right now to get Canada and Alaska to bring missiles into the Arctic as part of a northern attack on Russia. This didn't come about overnight. This has been going on since the breakup of the Soviet Union. This was the one world government, the New World Order that Zbigniew Brzezinski, that George Bush Sr., that Kissinger, that Joe Biden celebrated in 1992. So these are some of the important factors to keep in mind. And I don't want to depress everybody here, but I had to go through a little bit of negation before we could properly, I think, appreciate the positive light. So a little bit of darkness sometimes for contrast. Some dissonance can help you appreciate a melody. Now, I don't know what people think of China. I don't know. I know that the general population in Canada, where I'm from, as well as America, has been consciously driven into a fear, what's called fear porn, a frenzy of fear and paranoia regarding China. That's a conscious effort by the deep state, by the mainstream media, by the intelligence agencies. So if you were to ask a survey of North Americans what they think, I could tell you that generally they've been brainwashed to think that that's the supervillain. Unless you're a Democrat, in which case the supervillain is Russia. But in neither case, is there a general understanding of what are these things that Edward Snowden exposed, that Julian Assange exposed? What is the Five Eyes? What is NATO? What was World War II, right? Did we really finalize World War II when none of the actual bankers that funded Hitler, that funded Mussolini, that tried to use these fascists as enforcers of a one-world government, were they ever punished? No. Were the leading Nazis that that carried out such atrocities fully punished? Well, few were thrown under were certainly executed in Nuremberg, but I could tell you from Cynthia's work, anybody who's read Cynthia's writings on the topic or her new book, which they can get outside, little promo there, they would know that about 8 of the leading SS Nazis went on to run NATO's Eastern European Command up until 1973, unbroken. That's a problem. So there's a lot of false mythologies that have been put forth in our minds to put us back to sleep, to get us to forget that World War II itself was never resolved. So Xi Jinping, okay, whatever people think, I'm just going to look at some examples of what China is doing, what Russia is doing, but first some theory, some philosophy. And China, keep in mind, is going through a Confucian revival. There is a classical renaissance in China as we speak, a Buddhist Confucian renaissance. You could see it in the media, in their shows. It's phenomenal. But he made a point to the Central Committee in 2016 describing systems and how to navigate through the coming storm, that coordinated development is the unity of balanced development and imbalanced development. The process from balance to imbalance and then rebalance is the basic law of development. Balance is relative while imbalance is absolute. Emphasizing coordinated development is not pursuing equalitarianism, but giving more importance to equal opportunities and balanced resource allocation. Okay, what does that mean? Well, as we discussed, every system coexists as both a one and a many, right? I'm many parts, but I'm one Matthew. As everybody here is a one and you are a many. You're also changing and not changing. There's something, as I already mentioned, right? Everything that is a conceptual system, whether it's a galaxy, a solar system, a cell itself, which is a very complex system with many parts that move together, or a metaphysical system like a government, a political system, which has many laws, many parts which move together for a purpose, they have both something which is constantly changing, but something that is also not changing, right? And that's very important conceptually as just a matter of basic elementary science. So what Xi Jinping is saying here is that both coexist, but which one leads in the dance? Is it the ability to change, or is it the absolute relative limits, the stasis? And I could tell you, somebody who is a unipolarist loves stasis. They love feudalism. They love the idea of no change as the dominant thing. They don't mind it if people change their positions or buy pizzas. That kind of thing is okay. Or change their sexual identity or whatever. That's okay. But they don't like it when you change, you break the rules that cause the stasis, as I mentioned earlier. So compare the idea of not his rejection of equalitarianism, but rather opportunities, equal opportunities. People say, "Oh, Xi Jinping is a communist into getting rid of personal liberty and ownership and bringing about massive, just equal outcomes." Well, that's right there, just a total rejection. First of all, China has a massive small and medium enterprise thriving system of businesses, but it also does have national controls too. It has both of those things. It has social policies, but it cannot be said to be simply one or the other. It's something different. And the fact that people like Klaus Schwab think that we should all be equally poor as we're equally eating bugs in a world of equally diminishing returns as we equally wait for our suicide pill to go for euthanasia to stop being, a weight on the environment, that's a different idea of equality, which from somebody who represents apparently global capitalist interests at Davos. Very different idea, and an irony that should be chewed on. But it can't just be the words he says philosophically. Let's see what's actually happening in China. Because a lot of people, they just don't know. I mean, our media doesn't talk about practically what has been done in China for the past 30 years since they kicked out George Soros. Most people don't even know that George Soros is not even allowed in China to set up anything. He's been banned. How'd they do that? How did Russia do it? Russia also banned George Soros in 2015. They were a little later in the game. China did in 1989. But that's worth asking the big question, like, well, maybe that has a role to play in the massive increase of life expectancies. What you have here is the constant increase of life expectancies in China, which has now reached 77.9 years of age on average, superseding the United States, which has lost 2 years of average life expectancy under COVID. I'm not too sure about Europe, but I don't think the trajectory is so far very good. But what we have there is a consistent rate of growth. What you have here in the bottom right is the per capita GDP, which we've seen skyrocket massively as poverty has been completely abolished, almost completely abolished in most parts of China. And with the current orientation, we're going to see a full abolishment. And more importantly, not only did China pull out 1 billion people from poverty in the course of 25 years, by doing something we used to do in the West, but we don't do that anymore. They were not also able to offer it to other countries, their development model that allowed them to do in 30 years what it took the West 300 years to do, to go from pre-industrial to where we are today. Just keep these variables in mind. What you see up there, do people know what that is on the upper left-hand side? High-speed trains, high-speed rail. In the year 2000, China had zero high-speed rail that can go between 300 to 500 kilometers per hour, in some case more. Today, 30,000 kilometers, which they're going to double soon, on top of the growth of about 140,000 kilometers of conventional standard gauge rail. This is miraculous. Canada has zero. The US, pretty much zero. France has done well, but that's due to policies they let go of many decades ago. And that's a quick example of a high-speed train. They also have maglev, German innovation. Germany canceled their maglev plans for magnetic levitated trains. China built not only one, but they have current plans to build 5 more. That's a very different way of thinking about economic value. Think of Guterres, Antonio Guterres, right? There's 2 different paradigms of economic value that are splintering off. He obviously wants China to remain in the cage that they were in the 1980s, or go back to the promise of being part of the controlled demolition. Outside of China, what we have seen, this also, you have to hold that international US military ring of bases around Russia and China in your mind when you see this. This is the Belt and Road Initiative, one of many maps showcasing the miraculous rate of international connectivity instead of dividing to conquer, which is another symptom of empire. You know, anybody who thinks of a zero-sum game thinks in terms of divide to conquer. In opposition to that, there's unite and bring people together for common interests. So the rail development corridors involve one corridor through Russia, from China into Europe, from the north. Also a middle corridor, which we see there, underlying both Iran with another branch going over the Caspian Sea through Turkey into Europe. Another one that we don't see there is a southern corridor, which is currently being built up, that involves rail connections between Iraq and Iran. The Shalamshah-Basra Railway is currently under construction, which could easily connect to the 1,500-kilometer already existing system in Iraq that could go into Syria as part of a broader reconstruction program of the Middle East. That's one thing. There's other branches of this in Africa, in Arabia, in South America too, and offers for the West to join in this process of development. We've said no so far. So open systems thinking, which is what Xi Jinping expressed. When you listen to the leadership of Russia, if honestly, people don't read Putin's speeches, they don't read Glazyev, his advisor, who we're going to look at a bit more. They don't listen to their speeches, they don't read them, the transcripts or translations. But if you do, a theme you see coming up quite often is reference to the technosphere, the noosphere of Vladimir Vernadsky. Vladimir Vernadsky is a bit of a folk hero in Russia. There's a Vladimir Vernadsky Institute. He was the most important president of the Russian Academy of Sciences throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s. He was the head of the Committee of Productive Forces that was instrumental in Russia's role in World War I as well as World War II. He was the father of Russian nuclear science in many ways. And he was the founder of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, somebody the current batch of Azov-loving Ukrainians don't tend to talk about very much. But Vernadsky had a very interesting contribution to the field of natural science. Number one is he saw that space-time itself is not something devoid of life or mind, that no naturalist could ever explore the universe by assuming that there was such a place, there was any place that was not filled with the principle of life or the principle of mind. And the reason is that he believed that purposefulness is everywhere. And if there's purposefulness, then that implies that there's some embedded reasoning, because purpose is a function of thought, of reason. If you're a materialist, that would not be the case. As I said, right? The materialist says purpose exists because there are humans. If there were no humans, there is no purpose. Somebody like a Leibnizian, like a Vernadskyan, would say, no, purpose exists. Humans exist to participate in purposefulness. We have a purpose, but we choose it. But everything in the universe has purpose. The planets in the locations that they're in must have purpose, right? And the fruitful scientist is exploring that. The Max Planck, the Einstein, the Madame Curie, the Dmitry Mendeleev, they hold that firmly in their hearts when they explore the unknown, when they leave the known, right? They're not computers. Computers can't do that. Computers can only take what they already know and use as algorithms to go into the unknown. They can't make discoveries. Only a human being can do that. So, what did he say? Well, he said there's no such thing as nature itself. Nature itself is a coexistence of three-phase spaces. You have the lithosphere, the domain of matter that is not animated by life, the rocks, this table. Carbon, carbon is in the rocks and the table, in my jacket, in my body. But the difference between the carbon in my body, or the carbon in this table, or the carbon in a rock is different. The role that the carbon is playing, the nitrogen, the other molecules, is different. Because in the case of my body, it's animated by a process of life. The presence of life animates the behavior of the cycles of carbon, nitrogen, other things. So the biosphere is the domain of atoms, smaller but very important, that is animated by the presence of life. And then you have the noosphere, or sometimes dubbed technosphere, which is the, like, what is this? Is this lifeless? Is it organic? What is it? Well, it wouldn't exist in nature, right? This very thing, this machine here, this podium, exists because of human thought. Humans who had ideas and transformed nature in some way to advance a thought, right? A purpose. A chair has a purpose. I sit to sit. Simple. But everything that we see, there's really nothing in this room, very little, which maybe those flowers, maybe the branches, but very little exists just by nature. They're the effects of countless millions, billions, trillions of ideas, of thoughts which shape the environment that we're in. Even the language I use could be said to be fossils, noetic fossils in Vernadsky's language, right? So we're seeing the shadows of the unseen causes. And I'm saying this because I want people to get into the mindset of what is really shaping statecraft and decision-making in part of the world which doesn't want to burn. And a quick selection of Vernadsky from his biosphere is important, I think useful, where Vernadsky described the biosphere very differently from what we're often used to, when he says, the biosphere may be regarded as a region of transformers that convert cosmic radiation into active energy in electrical, chemical, mechanical, thermal, and other forms. Radiations from all the stars enter the biosphere, but we catch and perceive only an insignificant part of the total. The existence of, because think about it, every star you see it because the radiant beams that emerged out of that star came to you, right? What you're seeing, what's hitting your eye when you look at a star, is that the direct effect of what that star created in every spectrum of the light, beyond even what the eyes pick up. The existence of radiation originating in the most distant regions of the cosmos cannot be doubted. Stars and nebulae are constantly emitting specific radiations, and everything suggests that the penetrating radiation discovered in the upper regions of the atmosphere by Hess, which is the ionosphere, originates beyond the limits of the solar system, perhaps in the Milky Way, in nebulae, or in stars. The importance of this will not be clear for some time, but this penetrating cosmic radiation determines the character and mechanism of the biosphere. This is a much healthier idea of the biosphere than much of what we are being told it is. It's not simply an Earth phenomenon, it's a universe cosmic force, mediated by certain processes like the ionosphere, right, the atmosphere, the stratosphere, that mediate intergalactic oceans of cosmic rays that emanate from every star, from nebulae, from everything, which generates the atoms on the periodic table that are being generated within stars by processes we don't even understand yet, not even close. Again, the Crab Nebulae, we don't even know what that is, but it's generating a lot of energy in ways that prove all of modern standard cosmology and quantum physics is wrong, but we choose to ignore it. But Vernadsky didn't, and this is 1928. So what the hell happened? Well, the fact that Vernadsky is a celebrated name in the West and he's barely understood in the East, vice versa. He's a celebrated name in the East and barely known of in the West is an interesting thing. So 3 case studies and then I'm going to stop. So 3 points that are pressing on the boundary conditions shaping the potentials of our world today, the Arctic. I mentioned the East-West New Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative that was announced in 2013, and today it's really a very creative expression of physical potential, long-term thinking, 10, 20-year thinking. State banks, national banks that China never permitted to be privatized, they kept control of their state banks. If you do what Wall Street bankers do today in China, you go to jail, as it should be. You can't speculate on derivatives. So it's not just East-West. There's also a northern component that was announced in January of 2018 called the Polar Silk Road. This is embedded in Vladimir Putin's Far East development plans for the Arctic and Far East Siberia that were announced in 2019. This involves the creation of 5 major new cities to be built up in Russia's east and Arctic north, as well as what's called the northern longitudinal rail line that would be connecting the various northern ports. And the reason why this maritime route is so attractive is because it cuts 10 days off of boats traveling through the Arctic corridor to Paris or Rotterdam than it would if they traveled across the Straits of Malacca, the Suez Canal up here, the Red Sea, and Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That would be 10 days longer. So it's very attractive on a number of levels, but there's also a land-based road and rail development component to this as well. If you don't think that that's a factor in what the NATO military strategy is for militarizing the Arctic, got to revisit your thinking. Vladimir Putin first invited the United States in 2007 under George Bush to build the Bering Strait rail tunnel to connect Russian rail all the way through the Bering Strait, which is 100 kilometers of distance between Russia and Alaska. It would have been a 30-year project. Russia offered to pay $60 billion, and Dick Cheney would not say a word about this. He basically told Putin, screw off. Now, keep in mind, that was a few weeks after the Munich Security Conference speech where Vladimir Putin first called out his understanding that the ballistic missile shield being built up over the ashes of color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine was a direct aim towards a destruction of Russia. He called it out, and people can listen to that speech on YouTube. And then, in response, he said, well, we're not going to go for tit for tat. He said, what we'll do is we'll offer points of mutual collaboration, because there's a lot of resources in the Arctic. There's a lot of points that could benefit the rebuilding of our infrastructure, that could help Africa, that could help the world. But instead, we said no. But then this is Business Insider 2011. When Barack Obama was now in power, Vladimir Putin came back to the United States and offered it yet again. And once again, Barack Obama spat in his face and basically attacked him for whatever. So that didn't happen. In 2014, the Chinese government officially endorsed this, saying that this is an integral part of China's Arctic strategy. I won't say more about that. But Putin, the Chinese, they know their history a lot better than the West does. And Putin also understood that this used to be the most important driving force of 19th century geopolitics after the US Civil War. What you see right there is an 1890 map that was commissioned by Colorado's first governor, William Gilpin, called the International Cosmopolitan Railway, featuring rail built up using sovereign national banking, as he outlined. He actually calls for Lincoln's greenbacks, which is what won the Civil War, to be revived and used in collaboration so that nations would be able to overcome the systems of empire and have a new system of mutual cooperation for a new paradigm that, unfortunately, a bunch of assassinations and a bunch of wars and regime change operations in 1905, 1917, well, 1914, and then World War II kind of disrupted a lot of this. But Alexander II, the Tsar who was also assassinated in 1880, was also for this, building telegraph lines and rail through that Bering Strait. This is an old idea. That was part of the big reason why Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1867. That's part of the big reason why Russia saved the United States by sending the Russian Navy fleet to the coasts of the United States. That stopped the British and the French from going in militarily supporting the Confederate South slave owners from seceding and declaring themselves a nation. So Russia and America actually have a deep brotherhood, a strong history together that were tied around the mutual development of the Arctic. Alexander III was for this, who oversaw the building of the Trans-Siberian Railway using American engineers and American trains built in Philadelphia. He was assassinated as well, poisoned probably by anthrax. Not anthrax, sorry, that was stupid. What's the Frank Capra movie? Arsenic, that's it. Arsenic Old Lace, that's it. Arsenic. Nicholas II, in his own time as well, was for this. We know what happened to him. So, in Canada, I got to do a little tip of the hat to Canada, that's where I'm from. There was one effort, a serious one, to have Arctic cities and a new platform of development for the last unexplored territory on the Earth under this fellow here, John Diefenbaker, probably the only authentic prime minister that Canada had in the 20th century, who a few months after JFK was killed, found himself overthrown in a coup d'etat. There's a whole chapter on that in my book. This is an outline for a government-funded prototype of science cities in Nunavut that would involve utilizing small nuclear reactors with advanced cities, both for science, development, but also whole families. It's really hard to imagine that way of thinking, but he wanted this to be the basis of a new paradigm of development. It would have been done largely with the help of the United States under John F. Kennedy, and also probably would have offered a lot of new dynamics to Russia as well, but we don't know. So that's one boundary condition pressing on our future. Another boundary condition that I think is very important, shaping the contours, the invisible contours of the world we live in, is the Middle East, or Southwest Asia, as I think most Middle Easterns prefer to be called. The Middle East does have certain British imperial connotation, after all. So what does nation building under a unipolar agenda look like? Well, we know what democracy building, the rules-based international order that we're supposed to champion, we know what that's done for Iraq before and after nation building, Libya before and after nation building, Yemen, Syria. It's hell on earth. So that's one way of interfacing with Southwest Asia. Okay, what's a better way? Well, we already saw this map. So I threw a few things out there. Okay. Well, as of now, China has just brokered a deal to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That has now happened in Beijing. That's a big deal. That's a huge deal. Because up until now, Saudi Arabia has been used, much as Turkey, as a conduit or a tool of Western imperialists to launder money, to fuel, to use basically oil revenues to support black operations, the support of terrorism, ISIS. None of these things could exist were it not for conduits in Saudi Arabia, certain assets in Turkey. But recent years have shown the leadership of Turkey and of Saudi Arabia, especially in other Gulf states, that their future is not necessarily as secured as they thought. They're much more flush, in English the word is flushable, disposable, than they wanted to believe. So what we've had is a transition, a motion towards building diplomatic lines, even recognizing that Syria cannot be overthrown anymore. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey have finally come to grips with that fact and are reopening diplomatic channels. Very important concepts. But it's also tied to the fact that China is offering Saudi Arabia and other countries the chance to not just be stuck in oil, but to have manufacturing, to have science and technology. That's something that the West never permitted, ever. Here's one quick example of something that was being done in Syria called Bashar al-Assad's Grand 5C strategy, first unveiled in 2004, involving the connection of all of the major Red Sea, Persian Gulf, Caspian Sea, Black Sea, Mediterranean under rail and development corridors. That would have brought about a very different dynamic, which unfortunately was upset with the Arab Spring and then everything that came after 2011 in Syria. But that's being brought back. There's new discussion now on a very high level to bring back and revive this very visionary program, which at the time was also working in tandem. This is a 2009 design, which was moving in tandem with Gaddafi's Great Man-Made Water Project. People have probably heard of that? Yeah, some have? Okay. This is a project, 2009-10, Gaddafi was working to tap into some of the fresh water resources, which are abundant under the Sahara, to green big portions of Libya and broader Sahara region. We don't know why that water went under. We know it is. So the question is, how do you use it to bring life back? Is the desert naturally just a lifeless desert? Is the desert happier that way? Or is it more natural to bring fresh water and bring the biosphere back the way it was 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in that region? Gaddafi was trying to, and NATO, that was the first place that was destroyed, were all of the different great man-made water projects, as well as other vital infrastructure. Again, not an accident. Another component that affects both Southwest Asia, but also the broader Central Asia, that plays a very big role geopolitically, is the international north-south transportation corridor. It was originally put online by India, Iran, and Russia back in 2002, but it stalled. It was sabotaged. Increasingly, it involves about 17 countries, 12 directly, that stretch down with both rail corridors, but also secondary routes, and manufacturing zones, special economic zones that would be built up. Different energy corridors too, that would go from St. Petersburg all the way down through Georgia, which currently has a Western-directed riot system going on right now to destabilize that government, into Armenia and Azerbaijan, down into Iran, with offshoots into Turkey, into Basra, into Syria, into Lebanon. You would have basically go down into the ports of Bandar al-Abbas in Iran, and hence into India. Western geopoliticians have been trying to frame this as a rival to the Belt and Road Initiative, but in recent 2 years, it is completely integrated. These are two sides of the same thing. Vladimir Putin's leading advisor, a man who is the minister in charge of macroeconomics development, is Sergei Glazyev, who has been overseeing the integration of the Chinese economic bloc with the Eurasian Economic Union. We're going to see more of his thoughts very soon. Some quick examples of just development, different ideas to green big regions of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula that have been put forth. What you have here are rail lines that have been supported. There's, I think, 9 or 10 different rail lines, east, west, north, south, across the continent of Africa as part of the Africa Agenda 2063, which calls for not only a system of free trade within Africa for the first time to allow for the flow of goods within the continent, but also a protective tariff to stop the dumping of goods from outside, but also rail development that involves, in some cases, high-speed rail, like this middle corridor here from Djibouti all the way to Dakar. That's been endorsed by China directly. Chinese firms are already building this in piecemeal, starting with the Djibouti to Addis Ababa Railway. That's also part of a broader Ethiopian strategy for the Grand Renaissance Dam, building 6,000 gigawatts of hydroelectric power as of now. The destabilizations of Ethiopia caused by Western proxies in Tigray in the north has a lot to do with this positive development happening here. All of these programs would be transformative, and I think one thing important to keep in mind is that they would involve, for the first time ever, using common gauge railway. All of the imperialists, as many people who have looked at this know, never permitted, whether Belgium, French, British, Dutch, they never permitted common gauge rail systems anywhere in Africa in order to ensure that the continent would stay dependent and underdeveloped, divide to conquer. So this is now a rejection of that. You also have a program endorsed by the biggest Chinese water firm that's also building the biggest Move South Water North project currently underway. Phase 2, 1 and 2 are built in China, that involves moving water from the flood regions of the south into the dry regions of the north that would green big parts of the Gobi Desert. These same firms are involved in trying to, but it's being subverted, unfortunately, to move water from about 5% of water runoff from the Congo River Basin, where there is floods, not a lot of food growing, because it's so destructive. I mean, it's a very chaotic situation, and create gravity, the natural bridging of the mountains and some canals, to replenish Lake Chad back to its natural zone. This would be a big part of greening the Sahara Desert. An Italian firm is also for it. It's called Transaqua. And just quickly, as far as what China has done, just one small example, there are hundreds of similar examples. The Loess Plateau in China is a quick example of healthy terraforming, where in 2009, we have lifeless desert. I don't know how that happened, but we know that by the act of mind with a long-term look toward the future, as well as an understanding of nature, can do miracles. This is the Loess Plateau, the same region today. You can't even recognize it. And think about the abundance created, right? The destruction of scarcity by the creation of abundance destroys the ability for people to argue that there's too many people on the planet. Well, if we have enough food, we don't really maintain that. And for those who have been saying that human economic development is antagonistic to nature, which is sort of a modern gospel doctrine you have to sort of believe before you even leave school. NASA just came out with this incredible set of findings by investigating the chlorophyll, the photosynthetic activity that was being evaluated by the satellites of NASA on the Earth, looking at the Earth. They found in 2019 that there is 5% more chlorophyll and photosynthetic activity on the Earth, mostly because of China and India. 75% of that increase of green mass is the direct consequence of India and China, not the West, which not coincidentally are the two countries that are the most engaged in industrial growth. That's not a coincidence. Last point. This might ruffle some feathers because a lot of people have been trained not to, or to react very bad when the issue of space is brought up. But it's an important point because we live in space, right? As Vernadsky pointed, the whole biosphere is a cosmic process, as are we. So, the importance of space, as I pointed out, John F. Kennedy understood this, that you create new visions that are not based on fighting for scraps on the Earth. The internet, cell phone, GPS, medical technologies, microwaves, there's so many things we take for granted that would not have existed had it not been for a driver of a space program that had all of these interesting, surprising effects along the way. When you're doing something impossible, it forces you to problem solve along the way that has all sorts of benefits. Polymers, mining, again, medical devices out of the wazoo have been created out of the space program. But it's also more important on a cultural level. It's a field for recognizing our common abilities and even happiness in discovering things despite our differences of nationalism, of ethnicity, of skin color. There's something that is more universal that unites us. And that's just a quick example of the International Space Program featuring a wide array of Russians, Americans, Europeans, who are basically pretty happy. Now, one problem here, and this is a quick outline of the Artemis program. One noble but failed attempt by the former president of the United States to create a basis of peaceful cooperation in space instead of weaponizing space. The current deep state in the United States that is active, running things like Space Force, is more interested in either having space for billionaires to make money off of having casinos in floating around space stations, or weaponizing space as part of an attack on China and Russia. So that's a very different philosophy. Just quick, I left my notes at home, but China and Russia together since 2019 have signed several different important treaties on mutually developing a lunar base by 2028 and putting human beings on the surface of the moon, which hasn't been done since they scrapped NASA in 1973. They're committed to doing that before 2030. China also landed for the first time ever a lander on the far side of the moon, which is where the greatest densities of helium-3 are located. Helium-3 barely exists on the Earth because of the Earth's magnetic field. The head of the Chinese Space Agency made the point that the reason why they chose the far side of the moon is because it has been receiving without a magnetic field, because helium-3 is still charged, a magnetic field would cause it to veer off, to bounce back into space. It has been just building up and piling up as it's generated from the sun over eons. One truckload of helium-3 can fuel the energy needs of Earth at a high standard of living for over a year. One truckload. There are several hundred thousand tons, as it's estimated, of helium-3 on the far side of the moon. That's a big deal. And the Chinese, the head of their space program, has made the point on many occasions that that is the purpose of, or one of the purposes of what's driving their program. They're also releasing probes to go to the edges of the heliosphere by 2049, much as the Voyager 1 and 2, to build up a broader mining program, both for asteroids as well as the moon, as well as basic science centers. And it's a very different application of the concept of machine learning, 3D printing, than we have in the West under the Klaus Schwab model. So the very idea of what this next phase of automation, fourth industrial revolution as we hear it, there's not one single idea. There's different paradigms. Another quick example, they've built 5 of the 10 largest hydroelectric dams in the world in the past 20 years. 5. One of the biggest dams being built now, which is going to be finished in 2024, is about 420 meters high, very big dam. It's going to supply a lot of electricity and a lot of food-growing regions through reservoirs and other water collections. It's building it with not one human being, purely 3D printed. It's already halfway done. So you have 3D printing going through layers with automated robots pounding the cement, being managed by a form of logarithms and AI. Very different idea than the type of mental shackles of a dystopic Philip Dick novel that we see people like Yuval Noah Harari pushing for the use of AI to control people's lives in a global feudal colony in the West. So very optimistic concept of space as a place to explore, to develop, and not to see as something where people go to die, right? Where Hollywood has taught us that space is just a place where no one can hear you scream. That's like what's been reinforced again and again for about 40 plus years. Last thing that's interesting here on this point, Dmitry Rogozin, the former head of the Roscosmos, offered the West in 2011, this is an RT cover of October 18th, 2011, where he said, well, instead of building the ballistic missile shield as part of a World War III policy against Russia, how about we mutually develop a strategic defense of Earth? Kind of reviving that thing that some people called Star Wars in the time of Ronald Reagan, but doing it to bring in now asteroids. Now that's again something that Barack Obama didn't want to hear about, and it disappeared. But conceptually, it's a creative idea because these technologies are not necessarily going to just disappear with a magic wand. As much as I would like to have a magic wand that would say all of the nuclear bombs in the Earth should romantically disappear tomorrow, probably not going to happen. But if you have a policy where the paradigm is win-win cooperation and defense of Earth, which involves humans and the biosphere, because asteroids are going to hit, whether we like it or not, 99.9% of the species that ever existed don't exist anymore. But dinosaurs, as they say, didn't have the brains to make a NASA. They had little hands and tiny little brain, and they couldn't do much but wait for the asteroid to hit and kill. Human beings are the only species to express the potential to break an extinction cycle. It doesn't mean we're going to do it, but we do know that there are extinction cycles. And just quickly here, this is a recent discovery that just looking at the last 500 million years since the Precambrian period, what we have are discrete breaks in the biosphere, in the fossil records. We don't have evidence, as much as the radical Darwinians wish to believe that life changes gradually with random mutations, causing slow, gradual modifications. The fossil records don't show us that at all. What we have as evidence is simply that over the course of every 30 million and 60 million years, there's several cycles that are embedded that they've discovered using Fourier analysis, relatively, that you have whole systems going through some forms of cataclysm, destruction, sometimes volcanism, sometimes asteroids, sometimes all of that, sometimes ice ages. We don't know about the pole shifts either, right? There's a whole bunch of electromagnetic variables we don't even know about. But we know that it happens in a relatively cyclical manner. And there's been 5 big mass kills in the past 500 million years. But for the nihilist would say, well, doesn't that just mean, it's like to everything, turn, there is a season. What's the point, right? Isn't it just going to go back to square one? We'll do it all over again. Well, no, there's actual evidence of a higher growth function. So even though we have this up and down, it never goes back to square one. There's baselines where the new system has higher abilities. Amoebas were the only expression of known life that we find in the fossil records. At a certain point, it gets very boring, right? Single-celled amoebas are very boring. They're not bad, but that's what they are. They can only do so much. There's only so much diversity. But as you get more advanced species coming into being, it gets more interesting, right? There's a greater speciation, division of labor, more complexity, but also more order. There's a law, but there's there's something that mammals have that reptiles just don't. And reptiles are good, and mammals are good. but there's something that mammals have as far as an expression. I think we all kind of know what it is. I don't know how to put it into words. Maybe it's feelings. Maybe it has something to do with the ability to express higher sentiments that mammals seem to be able to tap into, as well as biologically an ability to adapt to more hostile surroundings that reptiles, they get cold, they can't move, right? There's more internal dynamics within the heating mechanisms of a mammal, which it still requires more food than a reptile, but it has more liberty, more freedom to move, to adapt, and also to feel. Human beings have aspects of reptilian brains, they say, mammalian brains, they say. You know, we've got aspects that are in common with the crocodiles. We have aspects that are common with the wolves and the chimpanzees, but we have something more. And it's that something more that allows us to contemplate that entire process of mass extinctions and wonder, what's the purpose of human beings? Maybe it's to be the first species that breaks the mass extinction cycle. Maybe. Maybe that's part of the process. Maybe there's another reason, but maybe that's part of the reason. The James Webb Telescope is, I think, an interesting irony, because we're in all of this chaos on the earth, an economic breakdown, a cultural crisis, a military crisis, but yet we've had the ability to put online something, the highest resolution space telescope in history has been brought online 8 months ago, which has shown us the most penetrating, clear depths of deep space than we've ever been able to appreciate. And just one tiny section of the celestial sphere of space has demonstrated in areas that we thought were pitch black. We thought that people thought that there was no galaxies in these dark, dark regions. And the James Telescope and the earlier Hubble Telescope were put into long exposure. We're basically penetrating these zones of darkness and found that no, they're actually filled with galaxies. More galaxies than we can count, each galaxy being unique and expressing resonance with other galaxies. So each star within a galaxy is being birthed within the core of the galaxy by processes we don't understand. Galaxies seem to also be born and go through their own process of growth from, well, we don't even know. I'm not even going to guess. But we know that with all of this, we have order. Right? We have creative expression, but we have order. We have the golden section, the Fibonacci sequence that we could see organizing the growth formations of different galaxies. We see evidence of this type of process of harmonics on the quantum scale as well. This is what Max Planck was looking at when Max Planck made his pioneering breakthroughs, which he called harmonic oscillators. That was what Max Planck called the Planck constant. It wasn't a distance, the way the mathematicians made it sound, or who reinterpreted Planck. It was a harmonic oscillation. He was thinking in harmony. He was thinking like Kepler. And this is what we see. And I mean, just as an even quicker exposure, I mean, each galaxy has trillions of suns. Each sun has God knows how many potential zones of planets and moons. How many of those contain life as a cosmic force? How many of those contain maybe thinking life, perhaps? I don't know. We're not going to know if we keep on shutting down our space program, though, and cutting the budget to bail money or bail out too big to fail banks. That's for sure. Or killing ourselves in a nuclear war. That's not going to help us find out. We'll just help the asteroids along. And the head of the Chinese lunar space program, Yi Peijiang, said something very beautiful. And I thought it was a very poetic thing to say for a scientist when he said, the universe is an ocean. The moon is the Diaoyu Islands. Mars is the Huangyan Islands. If we don't go there now, even though we are capable of doing so, then we have failed our descendants. As far as the Chinese Confucian philosophy that involves a much longer term mode of thinking, it's a 5,000, 6,000-year-old civilization, maybe older. They think in terms that we're not used to in our consumer society West. And it's important just to sort of reserve judgment a little bit until we really explore the writings of Confucius, the writings of Mencius, and think about, well, what is really animating the meritocracy and the priorities of the Chinese, as well as their broader Eurasian allies who don't want to go down in a hail of nuclear bombs. which leaves me to the very last slide. And I really wanted to end with this because I really respect, the more I've read of Glazyev, the more I've respected him. Show of hands, who here has seen Glazyev before or knows of the name Sergei Glazyev? Got a few, okay. So Glazyev is somebody who, I'm not going to go through his whole biography. He's a student of Lyndon LaRouche directly. He gave a wonderful memorial, a memorial eulogy to LaRouche, who died a few years ago, and pointed out the science of economy, investigating deep history as well as culture, which he learned from studying LaRouche. And I encourage people, they can go and listen to his 13-minute eulogy online. It's beautiful. But he makes a point, and he's been the advisor to Putin. He's also, like I said, the minister-in-chief of macroeconomic integration of the Eurasian Economic Union, and a big player involving or behind the scenes organizing the work that Russia and China are doing together that is bringing on India and a few other countries too. I would say by few, I mean 75+% of the world population. Ideas rule the world. And no society, this is 2022, by the way, and no society, no state can do without ideology. When the absence of ideology is declared, it means the power of money, because the declared lack of ideology in the state and society is the recognition that they do not have a single system of values. They do not have goals of general development, which above all are private and clan interests. The absence of ideology is a kind of disguise of ultra-liberal libertarian ideology where the main thing is the interest of profit, greed. And as historical experience shows, such a society and such a state will inevitably crumble because they will plunge into the abyss of private and class antagonisms. When they forbade us to have an ideology, they cited the United States as an example. And here he's talking about the 1990s perestroika Russia, right, that was being raped. They said, no ideology, just let the markets rule, right? Don't have thoughts governing economic or policy. Let the markets decide, invisible hands. But invisible hands are invisible because it's better to steal your money when they're invisible. They cited the United States as an example. They say, there is an ideology that is understandable to the average person, a house with a lawn, a car, etc. It was, of course, a simple announcement to the point of primitivism, because the real ideology that the American ruling class unwaveringly pursues is the ideology of world domination. This is the idea of creating a global oligarchy that will rule the entire world and, in fact, exploit all of humanity, relying on the monopolistic manipulation of world capital. Within the framework of this coordinate system, Russia can only be a country of slaves at a more technological level than in Hitler's Third Reich, with birth control, movement control, and opinion control, etc. And the question of what kind of ideology our country needs is hard to answer. So he's saying Russia does need an idea, an ideology governing, but what will it be? Russian society is so divided that many social groups have directly opposing views on this issue. Therefore, one can now attempt to formulate only the most general principles of such an ideology. So it's like, what's he saying here, right? Is he saying we're going to craft an artificial synthetic religion? Is that what he's saying? Or is he saying something more universal? And let's just see. The theory of long-term economic development, which I am currently pursuing, shows that as human society develops, limits to growth appear, periods of stagnation and threats to the development of humanity's very existence appear, which must be overcome. The principle of overcoming these limits, difficulties, threats, fighting for something new, positive, creating new opportunities for the development of not only of Russia, but of all humanity. This, I believe, is the key principle of ideology that lies in the depths of the Russian character.